dandelion. It's a dynamic accumulator. It's got this taproot that goes deep into the soil and mines for minerals for all the other plants. So the plants around it will communicate to the dandelion, say, hey, we need magnesium and calcium. And so the dandelion does its job and it energizes the ground with these nutrients and vitamins.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am your host, Ashton Szabo. I'm really excited about today's show because we're diving into territory that we've never even approached on the show before, but it's something that I'm really passionate about. When my family and I moved up to Northern California a few months ago, we finally had land and space to have our own garden. When I lived back in San Diego, we had a garden, but it was rather small and I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. Same when I lived in Thailand, I had a little garden that I had next to my hut, but didn't really know what I was doing any of the time. Being up here and being able to be in our own garden really reminds me how important this is for everyone to be doing. It connects us to the earth, the seasons. It allows us to live more sustainably as we can grow our own food and herbs, as well as even recycling through composting. But of course, not everybody lives out in the woods with plenty of space. Most of our population is living in cities. And in cities, you don't tend to have a lot of space. But just because you don't have space doesn't mean you can't grow your own garden and live more sustainably. And that's where our guest comes in. Our guest today is Susan Gouveia. She's a master gardener and founder of the Society of Garden Goddesses. Through her farm, she teaches the community how to get excited about sustainable gardening and cooking. Really excited to have her on the show today. Susan, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, tell us a little bit more about the work that you do through the Society of Garden Goddesses.
Well, basically, I started the group about 6 years ago, and I did it because I was gardening on my own. I didn't know what the heck I was doing, and I found myself just lonely. I'd had a couple kids and kind of depressed and just like, oh my gosh, I need to create a life for myself that's fulfilling and is enriching and gives me a sense of community and giving back. So I just sat down and designed like my total ideal group. And I said, I want people that are interested in gardening, that are creative, that inspire one another, that don't like to gossip. And so, within 6 years, I have 600 people in my community, and it's just such a fabulous journey.
Awesome. Well, so we're lucky in the space that we live where we have communities where there's lots of room. People have some pretty amazing gardens up here. But a lot of people really don't have the space to create large gardens. And I think that kind of puts them in a space where like, oh, well, I feel like I can't grow a garden then. Or I know that I had tried living in Los Angeles and San Diego plenty of times before where, I'd see some herb at the grocery store or something like that. I'm like, I could totally grow that. And I buy it and I stick it somewhere and it just ends up dying because I have no clue how to take care of it whatsoever. Where does someone start? Like, where does it all begin? For someone that really would like to get into at least a little something in growing their own food or herbs or something, how can they start so they're not left in that situation where there's like, I guess I'll buy that parsley that's sitting over there and then ends up just dying in their house like it did so many times for me. Do they have to start assessing what their space is first, or do they go just on what they like to grow? What do you suggest for people who want to get started?
Okay, so that's a big question. So for sure, pick out things that you are going to eat. Culinary herbs are a great way to start. And, you really have to check out your space as far as, where do you have sun? So if you don't have sun, it's really tough to grow stuff. So you need, ideally for things to grow about 8 hours of sunlight. There are things that you can grow in less, and I can talk about that later, but so yeah, you need sunlight. So you want to look around at the real estate in your house and check out windowsills, balconies, your roof, I work with a lot of people that have a shortage of space. A lot of people I host from the city want to know how to grow containers and do sprouting and stuff that's really easy.
Well, I think easy is good for people, especially if they don't have really a green thumb yet. You mentioned containers. That might be something to dive in as well. You in another conversation, well, you had mentioned about under the kitchen sink for some opportunities for some things in the garden. I'd like to touch on that as well, because for me, underneath the sink is like that no man's land of like the gnarly cleaning supplies. But the fact that we could actually utilize that space to help have some room for other gardening stuff, I think that's fascinating. So what do you suggest for people, let's say that they've got the required 8 hours of sunlight in a space, they want to start growing. How can they start to connect these areas a little bit of starting something on that space, and perhaps, like I mentioned, doing something under the sink as well? What can we do with those spaces?
So underneath the sink, first of all, get rid of all your chemicals. You just need vinegar and a few other things to clean your house eco-friendly. And then I teach people how to make these vermicomposting systems that they're worm bins. And it's a really easy way to compost, and it doesn't have any smell. And you can use the worm castings that you harvest to make a fertilizer for your plants. You can grow your sprouts in the worm castings, and they're great because they're pathogen free. It's not like chicken poop where, if you make a fertilizer out of that, it's, got a lot of bacteria and stuff. So that's one thing I like to do under the kitchen sink. If you have the space, you could store sprouts depending on how much space you have. So you could get a sprouting system going underneath, and that you don't need sunlight for sprouts.
Well, you mentioned vermicomposting. How is that something that somebody would go to a nursery to get the starter for that, or how would they, if they're like, okay, that sounds awesome, because it does sound awesome.
Yeah.
Where's that first step? Like, what do we do? How do we get it?
Yeah. Well, I teach people that you just grab a couple 5-gallon buckets, and you drill holes in one of the buckets, and then you put it into the other bucket. So there's breathing room for the worms. And then next, you'll put in a bunch of fill like a third of it with shredded moist newspaper, and sprinkle that around. And then you get some worms either at the nursery, or you can get some red wigglers at, wherever they sell worms, and toss those in there, and then put in some vegetable or fruit scraps. They don't like any meat or dairy. So you mix those 3 items together, and then you put the lid on it, make sure there's holes in the lid, and then you feed the worms about, maybe once a week, and you don't feed them too much. And you can look it up online what the good ratios are, but they like to be in temperatures 55 to 70 degrees, and then they just chow on the newspaper and the food and compost it, and the stuff is black gold. It is just amazing. It's very concentrated, and it just does wonders on your plants.
And you talked about putting the shredded moist newspaper in there, but also so that people can put like veggies in there, fruit waste, coffee grounds, things like that. Anything else that they can add to that?
Oh, you can wash eggshells and crumble them up and toss them in.
So instead of just grabbing your eggshells or veggies and throwing them in the trash, you can put them in this bin, and then they get recycled to then create this awesome medium for, as you'd mentioned, growing sprouts and making composting and things like that,
right.
Correct?
And you
Awesome.
want to make sure that you wash the eggshells, because you will get maggots if there's any like protein or dairy, like I said, residue in there.
Now, you said you're a fan of sprouting. Why is sprouting so great, and how can someone get started with sprouting? Now we've got the means of creating the medium for the sprouts, but why is it awesome? Why do you get people excited about sprouting? What's so awesome about it?
Oh, gosh. Number one, it's something to do with your extra seeds that you save after you harvest. 2, they're full of enzymes and full of protein. 3, they grow all year round. So you don't need, you grow them in the summer, you grow them in the winter, and they make fresh salads. You don't need to plant them in the ground. You just, you can use some worm castings and a little soil, or that's to grow sunflower sprouts. But the other sprouts I like to I use these stackable trays, and you can get these stackable plastic trays online. I do about 5 different sprouts at a time. My favorites are alfalfa, clover, mung bean, lentil, and they sprout relatively fast, and they're delicious.
And do you have any suggestions for people on where to use those sprouts with salads, sandwiches? What's your favorite way to use your sprouts?
I have this sprouted chakra salad that I make that people go crazy over. So that's one of the ways I use them. I use the sprouts in pad thai. That's what I had. I did a solar oven buffet today, and I used sprouts as part of the pad thai dish.
Now you're a fan of the solar ovens as well. That's something that I've never really touched on before. Is that something where somebody has to buy a certain solar oven, like it's a thing, or can they make one? If somebody has a decent amount of sunlight and want to cook with the sun, what do they need to get started with that?
Oh yeah, if you're handy and like to make your own little projects, there's a lot of different ways you can make them online. I'm lazy. I like to buy mine. I bought mine on Amazon for about $100, and it works great. And I'm just blown away that it took me so long to experiment with the solar oven, because I like I said, I made a Thai buffet. I was able to boil water, make bread. I made some pies, rice, made mac and cheese for the kids. Made a plum sauce and applesauce with all my fresh fruit that I harvested. And it took, and I also cooked a chicken. So it takes anywhere from about 2 to 4 hours to cook stuff. So a little more than twice as long as a normal dish would cook in the oven.
But also you're not using up the energy and the resources. You're taking that infinite energy of the sun.
Oh my gosh. And the
great.
Food tastes so much better. And I haven't had to heat up my house all summer. You know how hot it gets here in Grass Valley.
Absolutely. Well, anytime you're working on the stove, that also heats up the whole rest of the house, which is kind of crazy and not fun.
So it's not a good time.
So let's go back for a moment and talk about we've got this idea of how to make some worm composting for sprouting and for other things, for creating some better soil. What are some things that if somebody wants to grow that are pretty hard to mess up? Do you have any herbs, or I know you talk about edible flowers and things like that, something that like, hey, I don't know a lot about growing my own garden, but I'd like to grow a few things in my windowsill or out on my balcony. What are some things that are really hard to mess up for people that are super new to all this?
Oh, parsley's a good one. Oregano, sage, rosemary. I mean, those things are like, if you forget to water them, well, not parsley, but like rosemary, if you forget to water it, it doesn't care. And rosemary is so great because it grows quick. It's great for memory. You know, if you make a tea out of it, it's a really nice, refreshing tea. And, you know, you can make it rosemary salts. You can use it in your cooking. And then when you grow these herbs, you know, they're really cute little hostess gifts, and they're fun to trade with people, and they're nutrient rich. What else do I like to grow? Stuff that are categorized as weeds, like dandelions. I mean, dandelions are so amazing for us. And let's see, borage, calendula, marigolds, all those are nutrient dense and easy to grow.
And you can eat those too, correct? Like those are edible flowers?
Yeah, you can eat the leaves, the flowers. Those are my favorites.
Well, you mentioned something as well about giving gifts. And I think one of the great things about gardening is that even though it's this act that you're kind of doing maybe on your own, it has this ability to bring people together. Like one of the things I talk about the most with people in my community outside of yoga is gardening, because everyone's doing their gardening thing. And it really is a nice way to bring people together. Being able to offer people the foods that you create is a really wonderful thing. And I know you're really big on community. How do you suggest people bring their communities together? Maybe it's even just some of the people in their apartment building together through gardening. Like, what are some ways that, like, hey, I'm interested in gardening. I'd like to get more involved with my community. How do you suggest to people reach out to other people in their community to create some sort of collective or fun gardening experience?
Well, first you just invite a few friends over. That's what I did to start my group. I invited 20 people and 13 showed up. And it was just fun to gather around the table and pick out a gardening topic. I think our first topic was seeds and seed saving. And, you just create a new topic every week and have this dinner party and you do the garden chat. And people really enjoy the opportunity to talk about other things besides their child's soccer achievements or, the standard party stuff that sometimes we could get caught up into that's a little boring. And yeah, it is just, sometimes I have demonstrations at my house, and I'm really thankful to not be so afraid of food. I think people are just like, oh, if I look at food, I get fat. Or, all the intolerances, the gluten and the this and that. People are getting really phobic about what they're eating. Just try to get people interested in creating nourishing food with love, and it's just a good feeling. And plus, cool. How many people that people that like to garden and cook are really cool to hang out with.
Absolutely. I love people that love feeding people. So I have no problem finding some reciprocal relationships there. It's like, hey, you like to cook and feed people. I love to eat. This is a match made in heaven. It's perfect. So you talked about some weeds as well, and I'd like to touch on that for a little bit because I think a lot of people, even in cities, like you see weeds around, and a lot of people don't know that some of those weeds might be entirely edible. You might not necessarily want to grab the ones that are like on the corner of the busy street, but ones that are still around your house or in a yard might be totally viable to eat if they're not spraying chemicals and things like that. What's some advice you could give for people on finding some edible weeds? Obviously, we don't have the medium here of video, so we can't show like, oh, hey, this is this weed. They probably want to be a little more certain before just, hey, I think that's kind of what Susan said on the podcast. I'm going to grab that and eat that. But what are some helpful tips on starting to find out more about the weeds in your area, edible weeds and things like that?
Well, I just finished speaking to a bunch of Rotary and Lions clubs, and it's definitely a different community than I normally hang out with. And these people got so excited about re-looking at their property and their land, and they had no idea how valuable some of these weeds are because they're superfoods. And I mentioned earlier the dandelion, it's a dynamic accumulator. It's got this taproot that goes deep into the soil and mines for minerals for all the other plants. So the plants around it will communicate to the dandelion, say, hey, we need magnesium and calcium. And so the dandelion does its job and it goes to the leaves, and then it goes through its the dying process and energizes the ground with these nutrients and vitamins. And you can eat the taproot and the leaves and the flower. And it's high in vitamin A, C, D. It's just, it's another superfood. You can cook the greens. You can put them in smoothies. You can juice them. And I think I've read quite a few articles that it's proven to be a real fighter against cancer. Gets rid of cancer stuff. So, whoops, I can't make any claims.
That's all right. Question, do you recommend any books out there on edible weeds or any resources online for people where they could find out more specific for their area or get some visuals of this type of things?
There is, it's on my website. Edible.
We can link to it if it's on your website, then, because that will be included with all the stuff.
Got recipes that shows you how to make shampoo out of weeds, teas. Another one of my favorites is the nettle plant. That's another superfood. The chickweed grows all over the place. Miner's lettuce, plantain, borage, and all these weeds are listed on there. They have pictures of them, and it tells you their medicinal and nutritional value as far as incorporating them into your meals.
Awesome. So Here we got the situation set up now where someone's got a couple of herbs perhaps on their windowsill with their 8 hours of light. They've got their composting mechanism with the worms underneath their kitchen sink that's creating the medium for their sprouts to grow in their house, which is also adding wonderful nutrients to their foods. We've talked about some edible weeds that they can find. I think a lot of people too don't want to fill their plants full of chemicals, and fertilizing is something to talk about even within just having a few small plants at the house. But what are some natural do-it-yourself fertilizers that you can suggest for people?
One of my favorites is mixing the worm castings with water, and you can add a little molasses and create a worm casting tea, a compost tea, and that you can spray on the leaves and feed to the plant. And you can't overdo it. The other one that people don't realize is your urine. Now, I wouldn't pour urine on your plants in the house. It's more an outside plant. But it's kind of funny because it's like it's sterile. It's got calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, and it's great for your plants. You'll dilute that. You'll dilute that quite a bit, but there's recipes online as far as utilizing that. And then also there's a lot of weeds you can create in more of a smelly tea. You can use comfrey, yarrow, and nettle and put it in water and let it sit there for about 21 days until it gets really smelly. And then you make a mixture, diluting that with some water, and feed that to your plants. And that gives your plants a bunch of nutrients and minerals. So you basically can take all your weeds and make another fertilizer out of it.
Mm. Now, I'm curious. There's something that I know a lot of people on the island that I lived on were quite into, and I've heard this before, so I'm curious to get your opinion. But I've also heard of people using menstrual blood as fertilizer as well. What's your opinion on that?
It's a good one.
All right, there we have it. Done. Okay.
And animals.
Absolutely.
Gosh.
Okay, so that is another possible. I guess that's a plug for the Diva Cup, so it can get stored instead of through tampons. But so that is a viable option as a fertilizer as well for ladies on their moon.
That's recycling and reusing at its finest.
There you go. It's recycling. It's sustainable. It's amazing.
Never have to leave your home.
Absolutely. Okay, well, great. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack for people here. I think obviously there are some limitations in terms of like, well, what do these things look like? And that's where the mediums of the internet, where you can see pictures of things and videos. But hopefully this will inspire people to recognize that you don't. Just because you live in the city, it doesn't mean that you can't live a more sustainable life, that you can't grow some of your own foods. Even recycling things on your own is something that you can do in your house, other than just putting your recycling down at the corner or in the particular bin. You can actually be recycling some of your own stuff. So it's really exciting. And I think, to me, that's the biggest thing with anything, especially when you're starting, is just getting inspired to know that you can do these things. The technical know-how you kind of develop as it goes along, and that's what things like YouTube and all that is for. But just having the knowledge that, hey, we can do this inside a small set of space is really exciting to know, because even the things like working underneath the sink, we've got plenty of room, but I think that's something that I'd set up here in my house as well.
Yeah.
Any last suggestions or thoughts for listeners out there that want to live more sustainably, they want to grow their own stuff? Any final things to say to them?
Well, for sure, I just want to let people know that plants really need to be respected. And, I got really busy starting up my group and being social that I was kind of neglecting my garden and my plants. And I had sort of a dream, something come to me that says, you need to come out here and we need to tell you what we're up to in the garden. This is the plants, kind of communicating with me this way. And, just sitting there and actually talking to the plants and really connecting with them, they have a very high intelligence. And I said, I've made a promise with my garden. I said, okay, I will give you lots more love. And what's funny is I have my cactus, my Nepalese cactus, started turning out these heart-shaped cactuses, which is, my garden has a sense of humor. So I just wanted to let people know that really love your plants and talk to them because they are doing so much for us.
There's something within what you're saying too, and there's a book. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Secret Life of Plants, which really gets into detail about the intelligence of plants, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So for anyone that does want to do that, check out that book. It's something I read years ago that I highly recommend because it's quite eye-opening in terms of how intelligent plants actually are.
Yeah, I'm going to pick that up. I saw a video about how plants communicate to each other, and it's just giving me goosebumps right now.
Absolutely. Well, it's been really fun talking with you today, Susan. I appreciate all of your knowledge and enthusiasm about all of this. Where can people find out more about you and the work that you do? And I've got some videos as well. What's the best way to get a hold of you?
My website, which is gardengoddesses.org. And there's information on my personal retreats. I host a lot of public figures at my farm that want to get healthy and be in a private setting. So I teach them how to juice and cook and all of that. So there's more information on that on my website, gardengoddesses.org.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I hope people go and check out your website if they're coming up to the neighborhood. I hope they go check out your farm. It's been wonderful chatting with you today. For all the listeners out there, I hope you've enjoyed listening, and I really hope you're motivated to go out, try something, go to a nursery, go somewhere, try a few things. It really does make a difference just having more plants in your life. It's grounding, really going to connect you more to the earth, and I know a lot of people out there that want to live more sustainably. This allows us to get on track with that, even if a little bit, every little bit counts that we can do. So hopefully you'll go out and try some of these things. Thank you all for listening today. I hope you have a wonderfully present moment. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.